Hello, welcome. We're going to hit two assignments today. We might get to in such a way that our pace, we begin to outpace the syllabus, and we could just have one, or even sometimes we might even not have a Zoom meeting. But for now, to make sure that we cover things well before they're due, I'm planning on covering two topics, two assignments on the same day. All right. I hope you guys are doing okay. And before I share the page and get into the first of two assignments, are there any questions that you guys have? Feel free to either type like as a message or unmute yourself and speak.
And Professor, in the last assignment that we had last night, it said that there was an attached assignment to it. That's just so we can start taking a look at it, right?
Yes, I believe so. So you're talking about the Spanish colonizer?
Yes, sir.
Huh. So there it says that there's something attached, huh? Um, Let me make note of that and make sure that there's not any kind of an error. But I personally am not familiar.
As well with the newest assignment, it was let me double check. Assignments, indigenous, no, the Black Legend. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So the Black Legend we're going to do today.
Okay.
Catch up on the work you previously assigned. It's my first day in here. Absolutely, Mr. Carranza. As a matter of fact, normally I don't. I mark down 10 points late for late work. In fairness, for those who do it on time, but usually I don't do it on the first assignment, as I understand people are just trying to get their bearings, etc. And so I normally don't do it on the first assignment anyway. But in your case, Johnny, remind me when you're able to send a little message to me attached to your submission. Remind me that you entered lately into the class, so I don't mark the second assignment late either in your case. Okay? Because yeah, that no problem. Yeah, there were at least 4 or 5 of you that I just added like the other night. I finally saw your emails and did what I could, got some help on the technical side into adding you. So absolutely, you're not going to be punished for adding the class lately. So, but sure. But as for your question on the Spanish colonizer, I will take a look at that because I'm not. Let me see if I can share the page with the digital site. Let's see here. So I go to modules. And on the second assignment, Spanish colonizers, I presume. Yeah, so this attachment is the actual assignment, right? While we're sharing it, it won't let me go any lower than this. But you should have, uh, what is it, at least 3 numbers on this one. So yeah, I'm afraid I'm not catching what the issue is, and it's not your fault, it's mine. I'm slow on the take here. Have I not answered your question regarding some type of attachment?
Yes, sir. The question has been answered. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. All right, so anyone else? And also, I'm going to be jumping into your assignments probably this weekend as far as grading. So thank you for your patience on that. As an adjunct, you have to survive at multiple schools. So I'm starting at multiple schools. I'm trying to get syllabi, get everything running in the first couple assignments. I have in-class classes as well as online at 2 institutions, and so it's no excuse. But so I haven't come around yet to begin grading your papers, and chances are you're doing well, and I'm going to confirm it. But you guys deserve that, especially by the time you're turning in the third assignment. You're like, okay, well, I'm doing the same thing I did on the first, and I don't know yet from the instructor if I'm meeting his subjective criteria. So let me do my best at jumping on that very soon. Okay. All right. So are there any other questions before I get into the assignment? All right. So the first one we have here is the Black Legend. All right. With the Black Legend, the Spaniards were depicted, okay, in the early modern era at that time itself, like in the 1500s. They were depicted as kind of the anti-model, right? The guy who shows you all the wrong things to do, so that by doing just the antithesis of what he does, it confirms your own values. So let's get into some of the negative characteristics of the Spanish conquest that that have been often debated, etc. One, almost most, well, the two tend to go hand in hand, although they seem to be somewhat incompatible, or at least separate. Is greed, right? The greed for gold, and along with that greed, the willingness to exploit the indigenous population and African slaves. All right. So very greedy and exploitative. They're also depicted in a negative light of being religiously fanatic and intolerant, and being very coercive with their religion and imposing it on the natives. And they're also depicted as being very inequitable. And remember, with inequitable, it implies both the political realm and the economic realm, that their society was very, for lack of a better adjective, very unfair, very oligarchic, so that a few people were enjoying the high life at the expense of the rest. All right. So you think about the antithesis of those qualities, right? They serve to this day as a good anti-model for today's values. For violence, we're not for violence and colonization and being an imperialist bully. Greed and exploitation, right? You see that plenty in American discourse, and especially around the globe about American capitalism. And so we at least try in our rhetoric not to embrace that. Then you also have, so you have tolerance versus intolerance. You have anti-greed, anti-violence. And then, of course, we're for equality of opportunity in our rhetoric here in the United States and in much of Western Civ. And they were very inequitable. So you see, it serves as a very convenient, pedagogical teaching tool to say, okay, look how the Spaniards were. This is what we don't want today. All right. So there was a gentleman who was a jurist, and he wrote on behalf of the Spanish conquistadores. And jurists were interpreters of the law, lawyers, etc. They would write legal justifications for conquest on behalf of the crown, etc. And there was a big jurist in Madrid, and he contended that this was all a black legend. And of course, why things black have to be negative is for another topic. But he was saying that it's all a terrible lie that the enemies of Spain had conveniently made up, because he said that they wanted to colonize the Americas, the Dutch, the French, particularly the English. And of course, they wanted to disparage the Spanish as best as they could, so that people would think that their form of colonization was more benign, and that the Americas would be better off under their colonization than under the Spanish. So you have those things to think about. And that's why I call this the Black Legend, because it always seems to the big writers to this day, it often revolves around that theme. Okay. So in number one, if you've had time to read it, I somewhat confirm that Black Legend. Not unequivocally, but I contend that there is some credence, there's some credibility to the Black Legend. All right. And I try to develop evidence that shows a pattern of the Spanish eliciting those qualities. All right. But notice it's qualified, because at the beginning of the section, I admit that Las Casas should not be taken at face value. His famous book, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, because it just took Europe by storm. Okay. It was talked about for centuries, and it still is. In it, it's just incredible. As you see, like I remember reading as a student, the primary source where he says here, let's see here. Vindictively kill 100 natives for every Spaniard slain. They made bets as to who could decapitate a native with one blow. They took babies out of the hands of native women and killed the babies, dashed them on rocks right in front of the women before they raped and killed the women. It's just awful stuff. His book is just, it's hard to read. All right. But what I admit, okay, is that his dad was there on the first two of Columbus's 4 voyages. He was the scribe. So it was actually his job to keep an account. So he had intimate access to what his dad witnessed, not him. All right. He didn't come until 1502. They'd already ended their wars against the Carib and the Taino. And they were already establishing a Spanish bureaucracy by then. And because war had kind of died down. So a lot of his information comes from interviews. And of course, interview is a pretty viable method of annotating history, but he was not necessarily perhaps an eyewitness to as much as he contended he was. Like 3 different times in the Spanish book, he says, you know, yo fui el testigo de vista. I was an eyewitness to this. And people doubt that he was. It doesn't make sense of him not coming until 1502, and he's writing about things that everyone agrees happened before that in the Caribbean. Also, he wanted to persuade King Ferdinand, and after King Ferdinand, King Charles, to initiate legislation to protect the Native Americans. So he had an agenda, right, to try to elicit as much outrage and righteous anger, indignation within the crown himself and in Spain itself, so that people be angry enough to do something to change it, to change the situation. So hence he had reason to perhaps blow things out of proportion, exaggerate. And everything that he does that's a little bit confusing, like when I first read his book, is he'll say they'd go to an island and they begin massacring and this and that. And I guess I want to think better of humanity. I want to try to give the Spaniards a chance. And I think, okay, no matter what happened leading up to that, it doesn't condone what they eventually did. But can we at least get the context? Like something else must have happened, right? There must have been a misunderstanding, a quarrel, some sense of betrayal, something that likely led to all that carnage, which once again doesn't in the least bit condone the carnage. But we'd at least like in history to know the full story, to know the whole context, the surrounding situation. He takes a lot of things out of context and just mentions only massacres, etc. So I admit in number 1 that you have to be a little wary in reading this book. All right. For instance, you have the son of Columbus and Columbus himself. And of course, you have to remember they're going to conveniently omit certain things from their diaries, but yet they have quite a bit of information on a daily basis in their diaries. There was a guy named Acuto, his last name, an Italian friend of Columbus, and he wrote an account also that you could gain access to. And so, you know, you have these, you have a guy named Oviedo. And so you have other sources that you need to look into to really kind of put to the test, make sense of what Las Casas wrote. And so in doing that, right, I somewhat, in a qualified manner, try to elicit within the reader a sense of skepticism about this book. But then it's kind of the granted but approach. I say granted, it may not be believable at face value, but the Spaniards did show patterns of eliciting these qualities elsewhere, besides the Caribbean. So I start with the Caribbean, though, and from their diaries, we know from them themselves that they were constantly looking for gold. You see here from October 11th through October 28th, The Columbuses mentioned gold or gold fields 22 times in their diary. So many times more than once in one day's diary. They clearly demonstrated a fixation with finding gold as quickly and as high of quantity as possible. They conceded themselves. All right. We also know from their diaries and these other accounts that some of Columbus's men escaped from him in one of his caravels, kind of in mutiny type fashion, because they wanted to find gold themselves and they didn't want to share it. They figured Columbus was entitled to the lion's share of what they found, and also the royal crown had its royal quinto, its royal 1/5, that of all things go straight to the crown. So they wanted it all for themselves, evidently, and they went to the island of Puerto Rico, known as Boricuan, and there they fell afoul with the Taino, and with the Taino, they ended up going to war over seemingly their greed for gold. And then also you have the case of Cibao region and on the island of Dominican Republic in Haiti today. The Spaniards called it Hispaniola. And this region right here, Cibao, they were repeatedly told is where by the natives is where they got their nose rings and golden masks and other ornamental things that were made of gold. And we do know from their own account that they tried to put up a fort in the Cibao region called Santo Tomas, and a guy named Cannibal, who was the cacique or chief of the Arawak tribe there, said no, and they refused to leave, and they went to war with the Arawak, who were supposed to be their initial from the first trip, their military ally, against the Caribs, who were the feared tribe. And this incident of going into their gold, as well as the Spaniards, by the own concession of Columbus, the Spanish soldiers left at Fort Navidad to keep law and order there amongst their Arawak ally, were reportedly raping the Arawak women. And so they retaliated, and they blamed it on the Caribs, but they found that they found evidence on the leg of a wound of a leg of Guarino, their cacique, who was their main ally, that he had been fighting with the Spaniards himself because of how they treated his women. So, Spanish brutality started a war with their ally. Spanish greed started a war with the Taino. And Spanish manipulation started a war with the Carib. And so that before you know it, they're at war with all three of the major tribes of the Caribbean. And we know that from other sources. So I said, okay, so there does seem to be some truth that the Spanish could evince evidence of being very, very greedy and sometimes quite ruthless and prone to fight. So then you go to Mexico, and the cases that I covered are not only in the Broken Spears book. In the Nahuatl language of the Aztec, it was called The Day Our Spears Were Broken. When they surrendered in Tenochtitlan, Mexico City fell, and the Aztec Empire fell to the Spanish conquerors in 1521 in August. So that's a pretty interesting book known as Broken Spears, and it's an Aztec account. A guy named Sahagún did interviews of the Aztec and got their perspective on it. But a lot of the information that I'm giving comes from a Spanish conqueror himself, who of course tried to justify much of what the Spaniards did because he was right in the thick of it, right? And his name was Castillo, Bernal Diaz del Castillo. But even Castillo admits that they stole from Moctezuma's palatial treasure trove and took a lot of his treasure. Some of them, when they had to rush out in what was called the Sad Night, when the Aztec chased them out of Tenochtitlan, a lot of them drowned from the weight of their loot that they had stolen from Moctezuma. He admits to the Cholulan massacre, whereby they're invited to the dance of the Cholulans, and they were warned that the Cholulans were doing their war dance, and they were going to kill them after they had fed them and got them drunk. And so we'll never know if that's true. And the Spaniards decided they weren't going to take any chances, and they preemptively struck. While they're in the middle of their dance, unarmed, they cut off all the exits to the stadium, and they massacred the dancers and all the people in the audience, all the Cholulans who were allies to the Aztec. So you have evidence, from Spaniards themselves of them showing, again, greed and brutality in Mexico as well as in the Caribbean, right? And then Castillo contends that in that August of 1521, that you could not walk on the ground. You could not walk the streets of Tenochtitlan without stepping on a dead part of a native, indigenous, or Spaniard's body. That the fighting was so brutal. So then you go forward to, I also concede that the Spaniards had a way of continuing to use human slaves, even when it had become illegal under the 1542 new laws of King Charles or Carlos. The encomienda was granted as a ruthless incentive. If you conquer someone, you're entitled to their forced labor and to take their land, as long as they're pagan and as long as you teach them Catholic Christianity. And so that they put them to the gold mines, they had them work on haciendas, and in some cases they literally worked them to death. When the new laws abrogated that system legally, the viceroy, the high-ranking man for South America, who was supposed to be the king in his absence, the viceroy in South America was assassinated over the prohibition of the encomienda system, because the Spanish conquistadors, they had gotten a taste of the better life by conquering, and had become ennobled as new nobles known as hidalgos. And so a lot of them were tasting hidalgo status for the first time in their lives, and they weren't about to just let it go. And so they rose up against their Spanish authorities. And so you had to have the crown trying to conquer the conquerors, the conquistadores, who had been given a blank check to come conquer here by not only their king and queen, but also by the Pope. In the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Pope gave his blessing to Spanish Catholics and Portuguese to conquer in the name of God, and you can be entitled to the spoils of war as long as you convert them and save their souls. So you have evidence for all this. So I'm saying, you know what? There is a pattern in multiple areas throughout Latin America that does somewhat defend the Black legend, that the Spanish could be very greedy, very ruthless, very intolerant, very exploitative. Okay. And then, of course, moving on to U.S. territory. I want to do at least one area of U.S. territory. Now, I will admit, if I had an instructor ask me to write an account that adheres to the Black legend, so makes villains of the Spanish, basically, right, as the anti-model for today, and I had to use my data from U.S. territory, not Mexico, not the Caribbean, etc., I would indisputably, I would go to New Mexico. The accounts I've read of New Mexico, there was a lot of power struggle, a lot of rebellions, a lot of public punishments and executions, and it was just very conflict ridden. And so I give that account. I'm mainly going from one book. It's a guy named Ramon Gutierrez, and his book is called When Jesus Came, the Corn Mothers Went Away. And it's very much conflict history, where it just focuses upon that, upon power dynamics, war, etc. So in his book, it starts off from the get-go rather manipulative. Don Juan de Oñate, the governor coming in, he claims the status of adelantado. If you go adelante, you go forward and you claim new pagan lands, you're entitled to, like, the encomienda, force them to labor, take their land, but you're obligated to convert them. So he takes that on, and he immediately declares that the Navajo and the other Pueblo, because Pueblo is just generic, right, for people who made cities, because they made some impressive cities there in New Mexico, like Chaco Canyon, Pueblo Bonito, these other areas. He demanded that they kiss the ring on his finger, and that they kiss the ring of the leading Franciscan monk that was leading the missions that they forced the natives to go on to and convert. And so with some of the missionaries at first, they earned, it was all about, in his book, power. They tried their best to discredit the gods and the elders of the Pueblo people and make them in awe of things Catholic and things Spanish. And for a while it worked. However, you had a time in which there were a new batch of clergy that came in, and they were literally connected to the Spanish Inquisition, and they were not like the initial monks. Supposedly, they were exploitative, they were physically brutal, and the rain stopped coming, and they started getting low on supplies and so forth, and they were losing that manatau. Manatau to the Native American tribes was power from the gods, that you could influence them by contending that the gods were on your side. And you had one of the priests who was molesting children, just awful stuff. And so it culminates in Pope's rebellion in 1680, whereby every single Spaniard in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and there were at least like 2,600, every single Spaniard was either killed or raced for his life out of Santa Fe. So at the end of the day, there was not a Spaniard left in that city. The molesting guy was crucified inside the cathedral by the indigenous people under Pope. And so the Spaniards tried and tried again to militarily conquer them. It took them 16 years to definitively conquer them again. And what do you know? It's like they kind of somewhat learned their lesson. They were a lot more lax and lenient on Native Americans continuing some of their indigenous rituals and customs. They didn't crack down on them just the same. So at any rate, as I have here, in conclusion, while Las Casas may have exaggerated and taken events out of context and devising a work meant to engender indignation and Spanish royal policies protecting natives, his basic Black legend image of Spanish colonizers as the anti-model for today's values can be supported on numerous fronts. In the Caribbean, in Mexico, and present US, Spanish colonizers could be greedy, violent, intolerant, and exploitative. While some of Las Casas' data coverage of events may be factually challenged, his general narrative is supportable. So that's my main point right there at the end. All right. Does anybody have any questions? All right. So on the next one, if you know me, I'm going to do a 180. And on a couple of these, I'm going to try to defend the Spanish, because I never want you to care or know where I personally stand. That's not my business. I'm not to indoctrinate you guys. You guys think for yourselves. I try to just bring in as broad a plethora of views as possible and let you come to your own conclusions. But number 2, all right, almost written with tongue in cheek, and all I'm doing is summarizing this book. And I thought it was interesting that this guy had the guts to do this, is he tries to contend that it's this overall system that ought to be blamed for the brutality and the exploitation, not the individuals who carried the colonization out. That is too easy to make a villain of Columbus. This guy was stuck between a rock and a hard place, and he did what he felt he had to do, almost as if his back were against the wall. And I write it with a smile, because I don't know if I buy this. And even at the end, you see my little comment that I let him off the hook too easily. And really, it's the author, David Boyles, let him off the hook too easily. But when the early modern era started, I just kind of with the Renaissance, the 13 and 1400s, is crowns became more inclined to disregard their strict rules of mercantilism. Remember, under mercantilism, it's the assumption that wealth and resources are finite and it is the divine right of the king or queen to decide on the allocation of those limited resources. So you had a house of trade, La Casa de Contratación, it was called, and they were high-ranking nobles back in Madrid, and they decided who could make the big money-making opportunities. So the big money makers, callously, sadly, were African slaves, indigenous slaves, cocoa and sugar, coffee, gold, obviously. Those were some of the big ones. You had to have really high reaching connections to the crown to have the proper papers to trade in those commodities. They literally would only allow trade two different little seasons of the year from finite number of ports. You had to show your proper paperwork, or you could be fined, or even worse, arrested for smuggling. So same thing for artisans, those who were skilled workers. They still were coming from the medieval time period where you had the guilds, right? And the guilds were like, cobblers making shoes, tailors making clothing, what's it? I can't remember. A few other real popular ones, bricklayers, etc. Right? You had to be joined into that organization in your city, and they could, of course, tell you no. You had to be fully accepted by the guild to engage in that trade for a living. So it was nothing like capitalism, like free enterprise. All right. But when the conquests and the discoveries and the navigational books that were publishing, people traveling and finding new continents, etc., took Europe by storm, it also happened to coincide with the beginnings of these international kingdoms, like the Charlemagnes. It wasn't just France yet, forming their own modern nation states. All right. And in the case with Ferdinand and Isabella, they were not the only ones. They both had their claim to the throne contested by family members. It was supposed to go in Castile to Isabella's niece, but her niece was a baby. So she took advantage of that. Instead of having someone be a regent and rule while training this young girl until she became of age to rule, she took advantage of that and she usurped the throne. And so they developed an army on behalf of this baby, this niece of hers, to fight her off the throne. And the same thing with Ferdinand in Aragon. He was contested by 2 or 3 half brothers. All right. So they decided that it was kind of a quid pro quo thing, right? You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Let's get married. Let's unite Aragon and Castile. Together, we'll be stronger than all the remaining regions in Spain, and we'll form a new modern Spanish country, and we'll get to rule it, right? So when the discoveries of these areas come out, when the Pope, Alexander VI, gives his blessing to all Catholics in Spain and Portugal to go conquer in the name of God in the Alexandrine Bulls of Tordesillas, they went with it. They said, you know what? This is win-win, because if people just go and try to conquer and die or lose all their money or become lost at sea, it's no sweat off our nose, right? But if they do succeed, they're under our flag, and they'll plant the Castilian and Aragonese flags over the Americas. And so it was they began to democratize the opportunity to come and conquer and trade and make. So they started to become more lax with their mercantilistic restrictions on having proper paperwork. So then you get people like Columbus. Columbus doesn't have the money to begin, like any business, right? You got to pay overhead. You got to pay money first before you make money. He's got to buy a ship. He's got to pay for soldiers, mariners to get him there, all this other stuff. And so he is at the mercy of patrons, someone who's willing to foot the bill and take a chance on him, right? So according to this book, he saw his dad getting nowhere as an artisan. And he may have had a chance to become an artisan, but he saw his dad just barely getting by. And he didn't want that. He wanted a better life for himself and for his family. So he learned to play the game. The Italian word for bank is bench, comes from the word bench, because the Medici, the Ciceroni, and these other big families in Venice and so forth, right? They would set up an open table, and it was like kind of Shark Tank type thing. And they'd have a line of people, and they would ask one by one, why do I want to lend my money to you? What would you do to make my money increase? Right? And very generically, according to this book, Columbus found that the most effective and persuasive answer to that question was anything you want. And that's exactly what he did. So they told him to go to the famous Luanda. Luanda and Elmina were the most infamous slave ports on the Ivory Coast of Africa, where the African tribes were selling their enemies to the Europeans. He went on more than one occasion to Luanda and picked up like hundreds of slaves and brought them to another destination. He was told to go to the Moluccas, the Indonesian Spice Islands, and he was told to that he would be helped financially to raise an army and to take over one of those islands from the Dutch or the Portuguese. Usually, those are the two powers that were usually taking them, and grow and sell those very lucrative spices there from the Spice Islands. So he had been hardened to this game, if you will, right? Long before he came to the Caribbean and quote, discovered the Americas. And so that's what he's contending here on number 2, is he's saying that it's too simplistic to blame Christopher Columbus for coming here. He goes to war with the indigenous. He brings slaves in and does all this ruthless stuff. But he was always indebted to his patrons who had lent him that money. And he desperately had to find a source of income as quickly as he could once he arrived somewhere to pay them back and earn their trust so that they would send him on a subsequent task, etc., and keep his business going. So hence you have that very callous letter from Columbus back to Ferdinand, because in his anomalous case, this didn't happen very often, Isabella lent him quite a bit of money. And so that's a big person to owe money to, right? A crown of Spain. And so in his letter from the Caribbean, he says over and over, these people are so timido, over and over. They're so timid. He says, he said, with 50 men, I could take any island. And he says, they don't know steel. They don't know iron. They don't know gunpowder. They're like children. He gave that kind of infantilized vision of them. And he says, just tell me however many you want me to abduct and bring back to Spain, I will. All right. And then, of course, hence his sense of urgency to find gold in the Cibao region of the Dominican Republic. All right. So does anybody have any questions on number 2? So I ask at the end, is that going too far? Is that going too far to suggest that people like Columbus were just part of a bigger system? They were trying to just get theirs, and they shouldn't necessarily be depicted as the key villains of this process. Right? So anyway, I wrote that one tongue-in-cheek. I'm not sure how much that flies, but I did think it was interesting, and it was kind of novel, kind of an original thesis. And then number 3. Well, number 3, there's a term in history. It's called historicism. Okay. And under the term historicism, it's assumed that people cannot help but be products of the time and environment in which they're brought up. Right. So the whole argument of what really makes us who we are, nature versus nurture, with historicism, it's all about nurture. It's not necessarily about your DNA from your parents. It's about how you were brought up to learn and socialized as a child and young adult as to what was normal and abnormal, what was right, what was wrong, what was permissible and what was not. et cetera, et cetera. And I say a few other things that we have been hit by, for example, that even if you're not familiar with these terms, we're highly influenced by them. One is I don't remember so much how they tied the scientific revolution. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna skip that one. But the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment and the Scottish Enlightenment, they were huge on natural rights of individuals, just rights that you by nature are born with from the time you're born, just by virtue of being born and made in the image of God as a human being. All right. And I don't want to get into too many of those rights because that is going to be covered when we do the American War for Independence and Mexico and Latin American wars for independence. Okay, but there were several leaders of that movement that we tie our Bill of Rights to here in the U.S. to this day. So the whole idea of natural rights that all human beings are entitled to had not come about yet. And also, I think the last one is huge, is classical liberalism. All right. Classical liberalism is best, I think, articulated by a guy named John Stuart Mill, an English guy in the early 1800s. And the idea is, right, is that he states that it kind of gets toward relativism, whereby we cannot know everything there is to know about right and wrong, about the universe, etc. We're all brought up with different values, etc. And he makes a very simple, plea, is he said that every individual ought to be almost completely autonomous. Remember, autonomous is basically just independent, that every person should be free to believe in whatever religion he or she wants to believe in, to adhere to any worldview that makes sense to him or her, to do whatever he or she wants to do for a living, etc. Right? And then there was an American who had read his work, and I thought made a catchy little phrase that encapsulates the limitation to that autonomy that each of us is supposed to have. And that was, and this is Oliver Wendell Holmes, he said, "Your freedom to swing your fist ends where my nose begins," right? So you do whatever you want, right? Until it infringes upon my rights, until it harms me. That's the only limitation. Other than that, if you're not harming anybody else, you ought to be as autonomous as can be. Do your thing, right? Well, that wasn't until the 1800s. It didn't take wind until the mid 1800s. And we're talking about the 1500s here with Spanish conquest. So that hadn't been really percolated as an idea yet. So lastly, if they haven't been exposed to those types of more modern ideas and assumptions, there's, like Aristotle said that you're formed by habituation, by your habits and by things that happen around you on a daily basis. They form you. The Spaniards, I'm making the argument here, were habituated to religious violence. They had the Crusades, the tail end of the Crusades, whereby the Pope, the leader of the Catholics, was telling them that you can have indulgences in the sacrament of reconciliation, which used to be called penance. You have forgiveness of your sins if you go and fight this holy war against the infidel. They also had the Reformation, starting about 1513. And they went to war from 1513 to 1555 with Protestants, right? And in 1555, it somewhat died down at Augsburg because they said, hey, how about the leader of every region gets to decide the religion of the people under him? And so that cooled things down a little bit, but still they were used to it. And then what Spain has as a unique history is the Reconquista, right? France, England, German states, they did not experience this. Spain did, as they had been conquered by the Moors. by the North African and helped by Arabic Muslims, right? They were stationed in Cordoba and Granada in southern Spain. And they declared it a caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate. All right. So they'd been under Muslim rule for centuries. And time and again, they would declare and get multiple popes to put their blessing to it, a holy war to kick the Muslim Moors out of their own country. And what do you know? In the 1490s, literally when Columbus came back between his first and second trips, he went to Cordoba, where he congratulated Isabella for knocking out the Caliph's Basha, his governor, his last ruler in Cordoba, and chasing them back into North Africa. So they were in a heady state of euphoria that God is finally for us again. He's allowed the Christians to kick the Muslims out of their home country, etc. And also when they fought there in Spain, there were a lot of dads who became hidalgos. Like I said, that is a commoner becoming the lowest status of a noble by virtue of military merit. Okay, so their dad was once not a noble and likely rather impoverished and received lands, titles, the forced labor of the Moors that he conquered as a newfound hidalgo. Well, under the mayorazgo, the hijo mayor, the oldest son, like primogenitor in England, got everything of dad's. So what do you know? Most of the conquistadores, like Cortez in Mexico, were second sons of hidalgos. They saw their dad raise his level of socioeconomic status and prestige, right? And give them a more comfortable material life by fighting the infidel and being rewarded for it. And oldest son was getting everything, so they were going to go copy what their dads had done over here in the Americas. And they would say, Santiago con nosotros, when they'd go to fight. St. James with us, right? He was their patron saint of the Holy War. And guess what? They were saying it in Spain against the Moors, and the cavalry said that in Mexico when they fought the Aztec. Santiago con nosotros. So they were carrying that ethos, that holy war ethos, across the Atlantic Ocean. It's all they knew. All right. So I'm saying on number 3 that yes, by today's standards, they were intolerant. They were quite brutal. They were ethnocentric, like putting their own culture and worldview as the center of the universe and judging everybody by their own worldview. But they didn't know any better. It's all they knew. And that judging them so harshly today with the Black Legend is not fair, because they know nothing of our time. So feel free to completely disagree with that. But I just thought I'd play the devil's advocate on this one. All right. And what I'm trying to do here, where you see the red, is I'm trying to prove Spanish sincerity, that their religion was not a pretext for getting enriched with gold and taking human captives and loot, that they genuinely believed that the Native Americans were worshiping demons. In the case of the Aztec, etc., there was just things with the planet Venus, and they called Quetzalcoatl the son of the morning star, and that's exactly what the Bible in the book of Isaiah calls Satan, the son of the morning star, or calls Lucifer. There's the dragon and the serpent were the most prominent symbols in Aztec religion, and the dragon and serpent are both likened to the devil in the Bible. And so you see these cases, right? Like here in San Diego, they were ritualistically invited by a tribe, these Spanish conquistadors, and they were waiting for a divine word spoken from a black crow. And the black crow started shrieking, something. And before the guy had time to interpret what the crow was telling the natives and Spaniards to do, one of the Spaniards pulled out his harquebuses, his pistol, and shot and killed the crow. And of course, that caused great conflict immediately with this San Diego tribe. And what was his defense? That was the devil, and so forth. And then, of course, the most well known is Sagun. Sagun is the one that gave us the codices of the Aztec, their books. He had Aztec kids who were nobles and knew what each pictograph represented. He had them write it out in Spanish for future, so that we would know what each picture symbolized about Aztec history and Aztec culture. He fought to have them defended from violence and from the encomienda. So in many ways, he showed himself to be quite an ally to the Aztec, this priest named Sagun. Nevertheless, he has a famous thing where he is writing about them sacrificing to the rain god their own children. And he says in there that they, right here, even he, however, in writing of the natives sacrificing children, ripping out the heart from the chest, they use the term arrancar el corazón, ripping out the heart of the chest to a rain god. They could not abide to continue such a practice. He imputed blame for such a deed, not on them. He saw them as victims. He said it's on Satan, our ancient enemy, who has blinded them into committing such an infernal deed. So then you had a genuine sense by some of the Spanish clergy that they really were taking these natives from hell-bound to heaven and bringing salvation to their souls, etc. Whatever we think of that today or not, that they really did believe that. So anyway. All right. And then with number 4, what this is I explain the inequitable structure of Spanish America. Now I'm going back to the Black Legend. I defended the Spaniards twice in a row. Now, like number 1, I'm going back to defending the Black Legend and showing that the political establishment and the economic situation were quite inequitable, quite unfair. All right. So you had a vice king, the viceroy. He was to ensure that all laws were carried out, and he carried out punishments for those who were deemed guilty. So in many cases, the viceroy had power of life and death. The viceroy handpicked the governors. They were not elected. Then the viceroy also, or the crown in some cases, chose the corregidores, right? And it reminds me of the verb corregir in Spanish, to correct. These corregidores were hated. They would come and to the city councils, which was the only representative democracy that was in Spanish America, was the cabildo, the city council, and the alcalde mayor, where we get the term mayor from. Those 2 local offices. Those oftentimes were actually elected. But the corregidores, they could come into town at any given time, and they could correct or veto anything that was established by that local city council and mayor. They also collected royal tribute, taxes, and remember, with tribute, oftentimes it was a form of public works. So they would come and demand a certain number of people from the town who had to be immediately drafted into the army to put down an insurrection, or had to go and build a church or a bridge or a road, etc., as a public work. So when you look at it, most of these offices, the governor, the viceroy, the corregidores, were almost always sent from Spain. They were known as peninsulares. They were from the Iberian or Spanish Peninsula. Okay. And then as were the oidores, right? Like oír, like to listen in Spanish. The oidores were part of the audiencia. That was the judge, the system of judges. And they were sent from Spain, educated men from Spain. So notice almost all of the positions were virtually only for Spaniards from Spain. And then you get this sense of kind of competition from the Criollos, the Creoles. And unlike the Creole, like in Louisiana, that seems to be a mixed blood, the Criollos here were supposedly from a mother and father who were both Spanish, but they simply were born here in the Americas rather than in Spain. And sometimes some of the offices became sold to the highest bidder. And some of these Criollos had well-to-do parents, and they could buy offices. The Criollos also helped lead the military. And so they developed their own sense of competition with the Peninsulares. But in that, right, you have plenty of written evidence that they tried to distance themselves from everybody else, saying, hey, we're as good as you, Spaniards, but we're clearly better than those around us. And those around them, remember, so many of them were mestizos, because so many Spaniards didn't bring women, and they had women with indigenous, they had children with indigenous women. And so the product of half Spanish, half indigenous was known as a mestizo. And mestizos were looked down upon as darker skinned and for their indigenous blood. So at any rate, then also with the economy is you had the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade. You had to have the right papers to trade the right commodities out from the right ports. And for much of Spanish history, they only had 2 ports available in Mexico, and that was very, very often carried out, where an entire viceroyalty, because remember, an entire viceroyalty went from Mexico, the bottom of Mexico, Mexico City, all the way up here to the frontera, the frontier here in the U.S. That's a huge, vast area, right? That's just one viceroyalty. So throughout down to the bottom of Argentina, there were usually 4 viceroyalties. And in each viceroyalty, they literally would have like maybe 2, 3 port cities that were open to trade, so that they could watch everything and make sure everyone had the right papers. So the whole kind of quest for the American dream was not open very well for the common mestizo and others in Spanish America. So hence, I'm contending that Spanish America was quite inequitable, politically and economically. This was termed in the 1970s as a pigmentocracy by a Chilean writer, and the name is stuck. And so this is actually a chart. I can't see that there, but it's like you have like, I can see the first one. Español, con means with, India, right, with a native woman, is a mestizo. The product of their union, the child is a mestizo. Then if that mestizo marries a Spanish woman, he's up to a castizo. Then if that castizo child marries another Spanish woman, he's back up to being called a Spaniard. It's crazy. And so they kept this pigment-oriented chart of a hierarchy in the Spanish Americas. And number 5, I kind of did a watered down thesis on this one. I thought it was worth it because for any of you that are going on as history majors, you're going to go across all of these interpretations in covering the Spanish missions. All right. So the first one were the hagiographies. Hagiography is when you write a biography of a clergyman, and because you're trying to promote him or her to become accepted by the Catholic Church as a saint, literally. And so there was a guy named Palau, Francisco Palau. He wrote a hagiography of Junipero Serra, right, coming up during the Sacred Expedition, 1769, and forming 21 missions up into California, right? And there is supposed to be an alternative to fighting, a peaceful method of colonization. Well, you have evidence of Serra showing great concern for the physical and spiritual welfare of his, quote, neophytes. Neophytes was the name that we give in English to Native Americans who were in missions and converted. When the Spanish soldiers of the local presidios would try to abuse the natives in any way, he would report them and he would get furious. Again, that kind of fatherly, paternalistic concern over, quote, his children, his spiritual children. He went through great physical privations. He was in possible danger in many ways because he wanted the soldiers out of there. And they told him that the natives would slay him as soon as the soldiers left. And he said that would be fine by me. Like he almost wanted to become martyr. And so his hagiography it was more than Francisco Palau that made such a name for him that you guys may be aware of the fact that recently Pope Francis made him a saint. And however, there were Native American activists who showed up at the Carmel mission to protest this ceremony, right? Because they said that however, physically benign he may have been, that he didn't beat anybody, whip anybody, etc., he was guilty of cultural genocide, right? He was causing the Native Americans to kill their own culture and forcing them to assimilate to all things Spanish. So then that leads to revisionist history, where you revise the romantic image of things, right? And revisionist, they cover conflict, like I mentioned in New Mexico with the Franciscans there. They show evidence of physical punishment through whipping, through fasting, whereby they would not feed them for punishments of different sins. They demonstrated the coercive nature of not being able to leave. Very often, if they left, the clergymen felt like it was inevitable that these neophytes were going to revert back to their pagan ways once they returned to their pagan villages, and their souls would be lost altogether. And so they would force Mr. Vallejo, that Vallejo is named after, Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. He was the comandante of the armed forces of Spanish California and Mexican California. And he was supposed to run them down and capture them and force them to come back to the missions. So you have evidence of conflict and coercion and physical punishment. You also have evidence of exploitation. There was a guy who, again, under the ruse of being very paternalistic, calling his neophytes his children, etc. His name was Narciso Duran, and he had a children's choir that he was so proud of there in his San Jose mission. But he also, other observers came and noted in the primary sources from that time that he ran things like a sweatshop, that he was exploiting them, making money off of them, trying to get them as skillful as possible in making goods and products that were connected to commerce that he could enrich himself in the mission from. So you have that as well. All right. Then you also have evidence of the Native Americans having agency. Supposedly, in California at least, they would try to lure them into the missions, but never coerce. I've not yet read of coercion. So they, some of them made, kind of the cost benefit analysis and said, wow, there are a lot of goods, there are a lot of things that I could take advantage of if I join this mission. So believe it or not, some Native Americans went of their own free will, quite a few, into these missions. Then they could be rented out by paying the friars, by local hacendados, leaders, owners of haciendas or plantations. And so they oftentimes, in doing that, they would get to keep a portion of the money that they worked for and give another part of it back to their friars, etc. But they sometimes found themselves being in a tug of war between the hacendados and the friars of the missions, and wanting their services, etc. And sometimes they took advantage of that, and they would get time to get long periods of time to get off the mission and to make money, etc. And so they were not just victims. They had agency. They made decisions that mattered also. Okay. So then in addition to that, and of course some rebelled. You had a rebellion in San Diego that brought about the first martyr of Luis Jaime, a friar that was murdered. And I know you had others as well. So anyway, harm. Then this is from the Children of Coyote, right? The Children of Coyote book on Spanish missions in California. He takes another route and says, yes, there was harm. There were some instances of coercion, but there also was a lot of harm done that was not ever intended. And his biggest example in his book is disease, right? This happened big time in Texas as well, in southern Texas, whereby the friars were supposedly heartbroken that they had their hopes up by getting all these neophytes coming willingly into their missions, and then they start dying by the droves of European ailments. So dysentery, measles, influenza, cholera, diphtheria, etc., tuberculosis. So obviously it wasn't intended, but it was damage nevertheless. It was inadvertent damage. And then also to the flora and fauna, right? Flora is plant life and fauna is animal life, because they brought in pigs and cattle and horses, etc. And it really messed up in some ways the Native Americans' California ecosystems. So it's a very watered down thesis, but I'm saying really it was kind of all the above. To me, those are some of the major interpretations that you'll cover reading different history books on the Spanish missions. All right, so does anybody have any questions? All right, so I'm going to go to the next one. I'll try to hurry, okay? Please remember that as a Mexican American class, right? To me, like I said about Las Casas, it drives me crazy reading about a very micro-oriented subject and they don't give me any context. What's surrounding situation? What else is going on at that time, et cetera, et cetera. Well, as you know, by the time of the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, the Mexican people are going to be absorbed into the U.S. So what's going on with the early U.S.? All right. And, and tied to the Black Legend, etc. Because remember, what Americans are going to do is they're going to make claims of exceptionalism, right? That America is special. It's special in that it is a land of opportunity for everybody. It's special in that it's a land of liberty and all that warm and fuzzy stuff. All right. Well, I don't start that way here on number one. With Virginia, the sources I read about in colonial Virginia are just as inequitable of a picture of English Virginia as any Spanish colony throughout the Americas. So you look at this. The people who established first effective settlement, okay, the first demographic of people who effectively took over Virginia, right, effectively settled it. They were known as the gentry class, Gentry. And the gentry class, you guys, they fought as cavaliers in the English Civil War for King Charles I, who claimed the divine right to rule as he pleased, the primacy of the Anglican Church over everybody. So they were against freedom of religion. They were against the power of the elected parliament. Well, let's face it, the elected House of Commons, not the House of Lords. They were given their position because of birth. But at least the lower branch of Parliament was elected, right? They were against checks and balances with power, etc. So they were very kind of, regressive, almost like wanting to go back to the old medieval days. They were not progressive, like forward looking. So these gentrymen coming from the south and west of England, they were accustomed to ruling the roost. They were accustomed to owning wealth in the form of land ownership and having command over the people that labor on their land. Okay. They were accustomed to, like I said, not much with checks and balances, to ruling politically. And so that's exactly the way they settle things here in Virginia. They call it cultural baggage. Like you metaphorically take the luggage of the way you do things in your old country and you transplant it to the new place you colonize. So their cultural baggage was not forward looking, was not democratic in the least bit. So look at this. Beneath the royally appointed governor, a seat as a councilman constituted the highest political office in Royal Virginia. Between 1680 and 1775, 2/3 of all councilman seats, they were handpicked by the governor, were occupied by members of only 25 aristocratic families. In 1724, all 12 sitting councilmen were blood-related gentrymen. Of Virginia's 170 historical councilmen, 152 were of the gentry class. Only 2 were not English. As for the majority of immigrants during the 1600s and early 1700s, over 75% came as indentured servants. Right? Indentured servant, you were so desperate that you became a willing slave for 3 to 8 years. You had to be pretty desperately poor to volunteer yourself to be an indentured servant. But yet, 3/4 of the people in Virginia were impoverished indentured servants. 2/3 of such poor families did not possess any capital, right? Any money to work with, or work skills to start a business, much less wealth or connections to obtain land. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty darn inequitable to me. As far as the English claiming superiority over the Spanish. So the area where they had the best seats in the house, the most fertile land, the biggest plantations, the seat of government, the governor's mansion, as well as the royal council house and assembly house, were all on the coast in what was called the Tidewater region. Okay. Well, a group of people began realizing that there was nothing left for them in the Tidewater region, namely indentured servants who continued and finished out their terms, right? Because they're supposed to get freedom dues when they were done. You're supposed to get an allotment of land, a year's worth of food, and you're supposed to have been taught a trade that you could use right away once your indenture was done. Virginia developed a horrible reputation for the gentry planters not being men of their words. And a lot of people never received the freedom dues that had been promised them. So they moved west. And this becomes, let's see here, headed west to what was called the Piedmont region. All right. Some historians have called the West in American history the safety valve, right? If you have a group of people who are very poor, but very ambitious, and they have high expectations for improving their lot, right? and then those expectations aren't met, right? They could become an easy source, a combustible source of rebellion, right? When you expect to join the rich and they don't let you, right? You're historically likely to show that discontent in some way or another. So it became convenient, state a lot of historians, for well-to-do American colonial leaders to encourage their poor to head west. It gave them false hope, or maybe some hope, that they'd have a chance at least there. It got them out of their hair. And at least for a period of time, it kept them from rebelling because it gave them a new pursuit to go after. So hence, that's why that term is popular in American history writing. The West often has been seen as a safety valve, right? To blow off some steam so they don't rebel. Well, it's going to happen in Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. They're going to head to the Piedmont, and they went into Native American tribes' territory. The governor was making money off those Native American tribes in peace through the fur trade. Wars are expensive. They're going to disrupt his lucrative fur trading business with them. That's the last thing that the well-to-do governor wants, is to go to war with these tribes. So he sends a courier and with a royal writ saying that if you go to war with these natives, engage in violent acts, they will be seen as criminal here in the Tidewater region. And if you go so far as to raise an army, because they're already talking such, the poor were in the Piedmont, that it'll be tantamount to treason. And of course, the punishment for treason in the early modern era was public execution. So they did it anyway, under a guy named Nathaniel Bacon. And they defeated the Doeg and a couple other tribes. And they knew they were as good as dead if they disbanded. So they said, you know what? While we're together, while we're on a winning streak, let's just head east to the Tidewater region and let's take on the actual official militia there. And they did, and they defeated the militia. The governor had to flee for his life into the Caribbean. Nathaniel Bacon declared a People's Republic of Virginia. And he spoke not only about representative democracy in Virginia, but he also spoke of land reallocation, confiscating land from the gentrymen and divvying it out to the poor. That's a pretty radical idea. Well, Mr. Bacon got dysentery and died. And the movement kind of flopped. And the militia got more men, and they squashed the rebellion. All right. But that rebellion, to a lot of people, shows how inequitable colonial Virginia was. All right. And then there are two things that the Spanish had, I think, over. So up to this point, I'm saying the English were as bad as the Spanish as far as being inequitable. But I'm saying, however, I might even say, because of these two reasons right here, that it might have even been considered subjectively worse in Virginia than in Spanish America. For one, the juez de residencia, right? Judgment in residence. A visitor general would come unannounced and put Spanish officials under house arrest and give all of the local Native Americans and other poor people chances to bring any formal accusations against them for abuse and misrule. And quite often, the Spanish officials were removed and even arrested and sent back to Spain. So they had a system of accountability. All right. And then secondly was the manumission of slaves. Most of the slaves numerically were in the Spanish Caribbean and in South America, in the Spanish Americas. And there we see it in cities like Cartagena and Lima, that slaves were oftentimes rented out to do work, and they could keep a portion of their wages. Once they received the amount of money, saved up the amount of money that was considered their commercial worth, because sadly, under Roman law, English and Spanish, declared that slaves, African slaves, were movable property. The formal word was chattel property. So if they could get their value, they could buy their freedom. And I've read in multiple books that the Spanish did nothing from stopping that from happening. So you had a lot larger population in South America and the Caribbean of free African Americans under the Spanish. The English, you had to have the approval of your master. You had to have the signed signature and date of the colonial assembly and governor. And then, even then, 2 or 3 of the southern states gave you 3 days to get out of the state, because they thought it was dangerous for slaves to know that there were free blacks living in their same colony, that it might give them hope to rebel or run away. So the English went out of their way to make it more difficult for a slave to gain his or her freedom than the Spanish did. And the English did not have anything like the judgment of residence that the Spanish had for abuse of power, etc. Okay? And then Southern greed and racism cemented Negro slavery. It was a marriage made in hell, you guys. It became economically expedient to buy African slaves by the 1670s, as well as there was a long heritage of racism that was brought to America. So I'm kind of taking the middle road here, because sometimes this is a debate. Was it really just a pragmatic decision based on economics, or was it established on the foundation of racism from the very get-go? And I'm generically saying it was both. They dovetailed in awful fashion. All right. So what you get basically is you get the feeling that white indentured servants are becoming unreliable because of Bacon's Rebellion. And we literally have that, you guys, in writing. The assembly wrote it down for future generations to be able to see. They decided after Bacon's Rebellion that it would be wiser to use African slaves, because the white indentured servants, they expect too much. They want too much. They're too they have too much of a sense of what's the word? That things are owed to them, right? Then not only that, you had a fire in London and a couple other things back in England that was causing fewer and fewer indentured servants to come from England. So the supply went down, their reputation went down, and then awful fashion at that same time, the crumbling of kingdoms in Africa and war that brought about prisoners of war sent to Elmina and Luanda on the African coast, the opening up and breaking of the monopolies of the slave trade now made it free for anybody to engage in slave trading. They broke up the monopoly, so now you don't have to be well connected to go and buy slaves and sell them. And then also, they experienced at this same time, around the 1670s, a quote glut in slaves. There were more slaves coming from Africa and the Caribbean than there was demand to buy them. And sadly, even though they're human beings with any quote thing, the price goes down. So I don't know if I gave the exact numbers, but in one of the books, David Breon Davis, he gives the numbers. And he says that it was darn close, that the difference between paying for a white indentured servant from 3 to 8 years and buying a slave, because they established the slave codes rather quickly. By the 1640s, they started establishing slave codes. They made it based upon ethnicity. They made it inherited to the children. So the price for getting a white indentured servant for only 3 to 8 years, and then you got to provide him all his freedom dues. It was not that much more in the 1670s to simply, just for a little bit more money, to buy a slave for life and get that slave's children and children's children and so forth. So sadly, it became economically more viable. I hate to say that. It became economically more attractive. Now, having said that, we have plenty of evidence of racism. You go back to the classical times with Aristotle. The term Ethiopian means burnt face. Aristotle, I think, put it forth. These jurists from Portugal, a couple Arabic journalists wrote books in the Middle Ages, and they perpetuated these stereotypes of sub-Saharan Africans being physically robust, but culturally and mentally lacking. And Aristotle had written about the natural slave. He said that the Greeks were endowed by nature with great intellect. And he says they have yet to find a people who were greatly endowed physically, but mentally deficient. And nature had thus created them to become the Greek slaves. So well known was that classical source of Aristotle's that English authorities used that term, natural slaves, that Africans were natural slaves. They had the climate theory, that it was in places that are so hot that it innervates the people, and they're less inclined to create a sophisticated culture. So, never mind ancient Egypt, ancient Nubia, and the Mahdi Kingdom in Timbuktu. At any rate, so all this negative stuff you could read for yourself. There are a couple books there. Now you have an English writer, George Best. He put all this together. He amalgamated all this awful caricature of Africans. But look at this. Virginia legislator John Pori chose to translate and publicize Leo Africanus's racist work at a time when African slaves had just arrived. So what do you know? This is long before 1630, before slaves have come in much number at all, just yet. Remember, they came first in 1619, but just a handful of them. In 1630, a white man in Virginia named Hugh Davis was publicly whipped for abusing himself to the dishonor of God and the shame of Christians by defiling his body and lying with a Negro woman. So this is before it became economically expedient to buy slaves in the 1670s, or 40 years before that. And this man is getting whipped for sleeping with a black woman. Exactly 10 years later, another incident of a white man getting a black woman pregnant resulted in punishment for both parties this time the whip for the black woman. Antonio the Negro, Antonio Johnson. This guy came and somehow ended his term of slavery, obviously, coming from Africa. And he himself ended up starting a plantation and buying slaves of his own as a black African man. He became well-to-do, rather wealthy and successful. And he had property in both Virginia and Maryland. Well, for it was like Christmas season or something like that, and he decided to go up to his home in Maryland. When he came back to Virginia, they had confiscated his plantation. And he said, "What? I'm not derelict on paying my taxes. I haven't committed a crime. Why are you doing this?" And they decided, the Virginia Assembly, that we don't deem it, what was the adjective they used? Basically just proper. We don't deem it proper for a man of your color to own such wealth. So absolutely, with the case of him, made it very clear that he was discriminated against because of the color of his skin. And again, this is before it became economically expedient to buy slaves. And at any rate, there is another one just I'm going to put in here is, sorry, 3 runaway indentured servants. One black. His name was John Punch. He and 2 white indentured servants ran away the same term. They'd been under the same sentence, the same time, all that. But they ran away before they finished their term. They were caught. The other 2 had to double what was left on their term. John Punch was enslaved for life. And they made no pretense to it because he was black, because he was African. He was treated different from the other 2. So there's clearly evidence of racial discrimination before slavery even became a widely used, viable option for forced labor. Okay? And then lastly, with the Puritans, I have court and revisionist history in one on this one, okay? I first give the court history of how they claimed they were exceptional, okay? They and the Pilgrims. They believed, right, that the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was oppressive, and they wanted to worship God in the way they wanted to worship God. When they formed their own churches, they were called Congregational. That was the name of their denomination, Congregational Christians, because each congregation was to be autonomous. There was no group of presbyters, right, of like governors. There were no bishops, like with the Anglican and Catholic Church, to oversee them. Every church was independent. They also elected and, quote, unelected by popular vote their own pastors. And they were proud of that. They also believed in what they said, the priesthood of all believers, that Martin Luther of the German Reformation had spoken about, that any born-again Christian with the Holy Spirit is equally empowered to read and interpret the Bible for himself. So in doing that, they established the old deluder law. Deluder is deceiver. So the name of the law actually is referring to the devil, because they said they don't want their children to be deluded by the devil. And so they're going to teach them to read and write. And so they could read the Bible themselves. And they were proud of that. Literacy rates were the highest in all the Americas. So via laws beginning in 1647, New England authorities mandated that public schooling be implemented. Consequently, New England boasted by 1700 a literacy rate of 70% for men and 45% for women. As the textbook contends, such literacy rates were the highest of all colonies. All right. Also, what they're proud of is they very early on disregarded the mercantilist restrictions, having the right paperwork, and they kind of allowed people to do what they wanted economically. So people traded in what they wanted. People became artisans or skilled workers and making whatever commodity they wanted without having to join a guild or anything like that. So there was kind of more economic freedom there as well. And they were proud of that. The Pilgrims were, they wanted to separate from the Anglican Church in 1620. They were in the south of Massachusetts, in the east, there where it does that little boot at the tip of the peninsula. They were less controversial than the Puritans, who were above them in Boston and much greater in number. The Puritans wanted to purify the church, not move from it. And they had two separate colonies at that time. And the Pilgrims and Puritans, the Pilgrims was, oh gosh. Anyway, you have the Pilgrims in the south, to the south of the Puritans, and then beneath them, people started going into the Connecticut River Valley, and a guy named Roger Williams took over, was given the keys to Rhode Island, to establish Rhode Island. So you have Connecticut and Rhode Island at the bottom, and then the Pilgrims, right, in Plymouth, and then Massachusetts Bay Colony are the Puritans above them. And then above them was New Hampshire and Maine, right? And collectively, they're all called the New England colonies. So there were differences in different regions and so forth, but by and large, they kind of shared these qualities. All right. They were for a limited capitalist, a regulated capitalist economy, which was kind of ahead of their day. The Pilgrims established a treaty of equality with Massasoit, right? The famous Thanksgiving guy. In Samoset and Squanto, they had the famous Thanksgiving, and their peace lasted for 54 and a half years. The Pilgrims did pretty well with the Wampanoag Confederation, with the scary Narragansett above them and other tribes. They did pretty well of keeping out of trouble with them. The Puritans could not say the same. So now, and then they had praying towns, like Deer Island was the most famous. And supposedly these, like the missions, were by choice. They didn't coerce natives into these praying towns to become Christian and to learn to read and write in English, etc. Although, of course, they had them assimilate. But it wasn't coerced. So that might be true. But looking again at the much more controversial Puritans above Plymouth, above the Pilgrims on the map, the Puritans only lasted 6 years before they got in a war with the Pequot native tribe. They demanded that the Pilgrims beneath them, as well as the tribes around them, pay tribute to them. They refused to have a treaty alliance of equality like the Pilgrims did with the Wampanoag. The Puritans refused to. They had too many thousands of people. They were too arrogant with their power that they had and the gunpowder. And so they wanted everyone to be the Algonquian term was agua, like the Spanish agua, but with a W. And that means submerged to and subordinated to. And they demanded everyone, including the Pilgrims, to be subordinated to them and to pay them tribute. So the Puritans could be outright bullies in their foreign policy right from the get-go. They had double standards. The Pequot War, they had an Englishman, Captain John Stone, and he wasn't the only one, who was capturing Native American children and holding them for ransom until a couple Pequot warriors killed him. And they demanded that those warriors be brought to Boston. And of course, everyone knew they were going to hang him. But yet, when Captain John Stone was doing all that, the Puritans wouldn't do anything to stop him. So they had a very, very double standard. All right. Then when the when they were fighting against their enemy, the Narragansett had a peace term and even paid tribute to the Puritans. And they came in the Battle of the Wilderness. They came in and they attacked the Narragansett, and they killed a lot of people from a particular village. And a Narragansett gentleman bolted to a tree the peace treaty that they had made, kind of as to shame them, like, you're not supposed to be fighting us. We're an ally to you. But that's what the Puritans were prone to do, is once they would fight one tribe, they would start just fighting all Native Americans around them. And they did it again with King Philip's War. I mentioned the Pilgrims lasted 54 years. At the end of those 54 years, it was Metacom who came to Plymouth, made demands about them evacuating Connecticut and this and that. And one of the Pilgrims arrogantly laughed and said, "Who does he think he is, King Philip of Spain?" And that's why they call it King Philip's War. It's Metacom's War. And so at any rate, the Pilgrims started fighting after 54 years of peace with the Massasoit tribe. Metacom was like a grandson of Massasoit. Now they're fighting with his grandson. And the Puritans say, "We want in on it." And they not only helped them fight the Wampanoag, but they fought the Narragansett and several other tribes all around them that wanted nothing to do with this fight. So the Puritans could be ruthless. And then also how the environment of angst that the Puritans created in their own environment. They were supposed to be for the spiritual autonomy of every Christian, to accept Jesus on his own, to read the Bible for himself, this and that. But if you spoke anything against the Christian leaders of Massachusetts Bay Colony in Boston, if you had a divergent interpretation to theirs, they would make you publicly recant. Your behavior, when it needs to change, is repent. Your words and doctrine, if you need to change those according to the authorities, it's recant. So they would try to force them to recant, and if they didn't, they would either exile them or execute them. You had to come in and tell your story of how you had been born again, as Jesus said you had to be born again in the Bible to go to heaven, that you had to give them a convincing story of your born again experience, and you had to have letters of recommendation that you had become more sanctified, more holy, and like Jesus since becoming born again. And they have to buy your story or not. And if they didn't, you were not accepted. You still had to go to church or you'd be fined, but you had to sit in the back and you could not partake of the Eucharist or communion. So very highly selective elitist group. They had people called select men because of their notion of the covenant. And with the covenant is they believed, like the Hebrews in the Old Testament, that they'd made a covenant with God, promising to follow him in his ways. And so that if anybody in the community began sinning against God, that God would break that covenant of protection and blessing with the whole community. So therefore, one person's business became everyone's business. And they hired select men to come and spy on people's homes to see if you were up to no good, if you were sinning. And they would report it, and you'd have to do public penance and all of that. It's pretty insane. So anyway, so there was definitely a darker side to New England. And that's it, you guys. Finally. All right. So what I want to do is please don't leave yet. I want to get your names and make sure that everyone is getting credit today for this assignment for your extra credit. Okay. Sorry, guys. It'll take me a minute here. And feel free while I'm doing this, if you have any questions, please unmute yourself and feel free to do so.
Hi, Professor. Just to double check, this is the only time during the week that we meet like this?
Yes, sir. Yeah, that I apologize, but I have so many classes that I was trying to avoid doing it twice a week. And so that's why this is taking so long, because I'm having to do 2 assignments per session. Now, please feel free to send me messages, okay? If that's, you have stuff going on in your personal life, your career, your family, please let me know, because I can be dissuaded and turn to having it twice a week and only doing one at a time. I just personally prefer to get it all done on one day, because I'm doing a Zoom for 4 different online classes. Thank you, you guys, for your patience. Guadalupe, let's see here. Thank you so much, guys. Let's see here. Okay. I think I'm almost done. Thank you. Let's see here. Okay. All right, I have your names. So whatever your raw score is, I will add 5 to both the Black Legend and to the North American context, English context. Okay. So are we okay? Are we okay to close until next Monday? Again, feel free, okay? If I get multiple people messaging me, telling me that they would like to that it would be a lot easier on them if we did it twice a week, I could be talked into that. Go ahead, Derek. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say thank you and have a great day.
Oh, thank you. You as well. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, so you guys take care. I have all your names, okay? Message me on Canvas if you have any questions. I'm going to go ahead and let you go.